Okay, so this is Jason with Christianity and Perennialism. And this is a video that I've been looking forward to doing for quite a while. So I'm joined here by my friend Nikos. Nikos is a PhD student in religious studies, studying at the International University of Athens. And what makes it, for me, what makes it so interesting and something I've been looking forward to is Nikos is one of the few other handful of Christians that I've met that I feel like really gets the perennial philosophy and from a Christian perspective, which is pretty rare because, of course, Eastern views don't have any issue with the perennial philosophy. And as far as Western views go, uh, or Middle Eastern to Western views, Islam is a bit more open to it. But for us Christians, it's relatively rare to find somebody who gets it. And by gets it, I mean the traditional side of it and the um, I don't want to say the liberal side of it, but the open-minded side of it. Um, so Nico's welcome. I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you, Jason, for the
So we,
invitation. I'm glad to be here with you here today. And but please forgive me if my English is not very good.
yeah,
Uh,
no problem. Yeah, we so Nikos and I became acquainted in the I think it was the Rene Guénon or the Perennialist and the Rene Guénon groups on social media. Like it's probably like 4 years ago now or 5 years ago now. Um,
yes, if I remember correctly, we've got to meet each other at 2008, 2018 or 2019.
I think maybe 19. Yeah, I think it was 19.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah. Before I
yeah.
think it was like before the COVID stuff. Yeah, that was
Yes,
quite a while ago. Yeah.
it was definitely a year before the pandemic and the
Yeah.
whole COVID stuff.
And I remember, and I would myself had just begun reading Gnon, and I was all excited and getting into the social media groups, and
Mm.
we became acquainted. And now, look, here we are, I guess, but more than 5 years later, still into it. So it must be something to it, right? We haven't snapped out of it yet.
Yes, well, for sure. Just
Um,
you have to remember that even people who later went on to reject the perennial philosophy, but they still have and they have their respect and the admiration for the work and the person of Ganon or Schuon. I was recently uh, I sent an email to an Eastern Orthodox monk who was a disciple once, who was a disciple of Schuon, and then he came into contact with the Orthodox Christian tradition and he joined the Brotherhood of Saint Sophrony of Essex, if you have even heard about him. Uh, and this monk confirmed to me that Saint Sophrony have actually met with Schuon, and well, of course, he had he told me that Saint Sophrony had some reservations, of course, about Schuon, who
yeah, which is
which is natural.
right. And I think if I met Shu, and I think I might have even some reservations about.
Yeah, of course, which is natural. Uh, but even though he thought that Suan is a very interesting guy, and he definitely has to get some attention, to get some attention in those matters, uh, which he's right.
Yeah,
Because even if you disagree with Genon or Suon on their perennialist opinions, you have to agree with them, uh, especially on the critique against modernity and the modern world. Uh, which for me is unsurpassed. Their
Yeah,
critique against modernity is perhaps the best,
yeah,
and definitely, it's the most metaphysically founded critique that we can find today.
yeah. I've heard this exactly what you're saying here. I've heard from a number of not just Orthodox Christians, but people who reject the perennial philosophy in its spirit, but like you said, they're forced to give sort of credit to Gunan and Shuon for this reason, for their, how could I say, for the negative, and by the negative I don't mean the bad side, but for the negative side of their teachings, which is the attacks, you might say, on take dismantling the, what Gunan called the modern deviation.
Mhm.
Therefore, I've like I said, I've come across a number of very highly regarded, of course, probably one of the better known is Father Seraphim Rose, right? So you have
Yeah, exactly.
these types of men who they accepted the negative side, so to speak, but they rejected the positive side of them of Gidon and Shuon, which was the first they would dismantle the modern deviation, and then they would turn around and build up what the sacred that the modern when we say the modern deviation, what was deviated was the original sanctity, right? So it wasn't. I always think in terms of
Well, I would say that don't really they do not really reject the positive side entirely. They reject what they perceive as a contradiction to the basic truths of Christianity. But they keep what they see as positive. For example, the importance that Genon gave to the notion of tradition, uh, and also to the idea of orthodoxy, of traditional orthodoxy, which is a very important idea that differentiates them from the most vague universalist and New Age type of
Yeah, I,
movements.
I just wanted to
Mm.
add in there because I always make this footnote there that when we speak of orthodoxy in the way that you just use that term, we're speaking in lowercase o orthodoxy, not just Orthodox Christianity, but
Yeah,
orthodoxy as in
exactly.
is it true or is it false? If it's true, then we call it orthodox, which means what's the literal Greek meaning of the word?
The meaning of the word orthodox and orthodoxy means right doctrine. It is the right doctrine.
Right. So we would say in short in English we would just say is it true, right? Is it true? Is it
Yes, it
true
is the true.
doctrine
Yes,
or is it false doctrine?
the
Right.
true doctrine.
Right.
The
So
true doctrine.
the term orthodoxy in Eastern thinking just means that it would be like, is it going to get, will it get you where will it, like I say, is as a relative means, is it effective for reaching the absolute or is it not? Right. In the East, this is the way they would view the term. Right. Whereas
Hmm.
in the West, they view it as, is it my view or is it not? If it's my view, it's true. If it's not, it's untrue. Right.
Yes,
Um,
yes.
so
Um, well, I think I have to go on something that the great Plato wrote when he distinguished between 3 points of view. When he said that at first we have opinion, which in Greek is called gnomi or doxa. That is, opinion is something completely individual. It is an individual thing, and it can exist without any kind of revelation or without any kind of metaphysical or intellectual intuition. You can we can call it this. Uh, and that has as a consequence that opinion is basically untrue. It is unorthodox. But then we have what we may call a true opinion, or a true doxa, uh, that is orthodoxy. That is an opinion which is based not just on my personal and individual beliefs or likes or tendencies, but it is based upon uh, a revealed knowledge, upon a revealed source of knowledge. And thirdly, we have knowledge as such. In Greek, we call it gnosis, uh, which it is, of course, it's true, just like orthodoxy, but it is one step further. It's not just a true opinion, it is knowledge about the thing. And that is very familiar with the Schwannian perspective on this trichotomy. Schwann says that philosophy is based upon opinions, and theology is based upon revealed truth, revealed knowledge by God, uh, that is orthodoxy, and knowledge as such, gnosis, uh, finds its own foundations upon intellection, upon metaphysical intuition.
Yeah, I you just
So that
reminded.
is
Yeah, go ahead.
that's the difference.
Yeah,
I tried to express it as much as
yeah,
I could.
exactly. This is this is it reminds me of why I feel like the Vedantic doctrines are so useful, and why I understand why Genon used the Vedantic doctrines as his sort of foundation for everything else. You could think of it like you're familiar with the three gunas in the
Hmm.
Vedanta,
Yeah.
and these ideas apply. I mean, every time you see some kind of tripartite concept, you see the gunas come into play. And of course, the gunas we have tamas, which is they call it like the heavy inertia. Let me see. So for anyone who's not familiar, the three gunas represent what they in Vedanta they call them like the three natural forces, like the three natural phenomena, and these are how the world manifests. So you have tamas, which is they refer to as like it's the lowest one. It represents like heaviness, um, inertia, sort of it's the force that solidifies things. And of course, there's a positive aspect of it and a negative aspect of it, right? Like Schuon made the analogy that if in the Vedanta, people often speak of tamas as a negative thing, but at the same time, if there was no tamas, then of course there would be no manifestation, and there would be no, for example, from the Christian perspective, there would be no Eucharist, right? Because that's how we view Christ and all of creation coming together in the Eucharist, right? So it represents this condensing force, and then in the middle you have Rajas, which represents like activity. It's the horizontal plane, which we might think of it. I often think like politics is a very good example of rajas, where it's or left, right. It's horizontal, and it's always in a state of unrest. It's always in a state of conflict. It's always in a state of debate. And then at the top of the three gunas, you have sattva, which represents holiness, peace, sanctity. Um, and it's actually the most of the three gunas. Sattva is actually the most active of the three, even though it appears to be static. People look at Rajas and they assume that Rajas is the most active of them, but because Rajas is very openly in your face, agitated, and Sattva it appears to be. We think Sattva is like a commonly like a monk, a Buddhist monk meditating. Somebody would look at him and a Westerner would look at him and say he's very inactive, but internally
Hmm.
he's extremely active.
Exactly.
And not his body, not his mind even, but his spiritual level is very active. So speaking of this, what you described, so I made a meme a while ago of the common three part template. We have like the lower one and the middle one, the higher one. The lower one I put Neil deGrasse Tyson. You may be familiar with him. This is like the one of the stereotypical
Yes.
Western, atheist type of guys. And on the bottom of the meme, I put Neil deGrasse Tyson as saying, there is no God. And then in the middle of the meme, I put Father Seraphim Rose saying, there is a God. And then at the top of the meme, I put Ramana Maharshi saying again, there is no God. but
Yeah.
so the two, that's one of the things I try to stress so much on this channel that the bottom is an inverted reflection of the top. So
Exactly.
when we see these people now saying there is no God, we assume that well, the opposite must be true. There is a God, and that is true. I'm not going to say that isn't true, right? But if we continue to inquire, which this is getting to the difference between no in what's known in the Vedanta as gnosis versus bhakti, or knowledge
Hmm.
versus worship. If we continue to inquire, and not in a rational way, but just kind of as in an internal way, we're forced to the conclusion that the all of these distinctions are just an appearance. It doesn't mean they don't exist. It doesn't mean they're not existent. It doesn't mean they're false, but it means it's I often think of it like a leaf in a tree. The leaf has an existence, but it's not the existence. It has a reality, but it's not the reality. The tree is the reality, right? We can talk about the leaf if we want to, and we wouldn't be wrong in doing so. But if we want to be like get really down to the heart of the matter, it's a tree, right? The leaf is just a
Exactly.
convention. The tree is the reality, and the leaf is a convention. So if we want to speak in terms of reality, I this is people will take this the wrong way, no matter how many times you explain it. But if you want to speak in terms of reality, there is no God, right? Because there's no one to call him God, and there's no one to be called God, right? But if we want to come down to a little bit to the lower level, which is fine, there's nothing wrong with it. But if you want to come down a little, then we say there is a God, and there's a creator and a creation, right? That's fine. And it's still
Hmm.
sacred. There is still sanctity there, and even in all its fullness for those who that's sufficient for. But then we come down to the lowest level, and then here we are again. There is no God, right? And then so
Yes, that's true because even the lowest forms of intellectuality and of philosophy, uh, they partake in the truth as such. Even them, that is even materialism can be true in some ways. Uh, for example, I can take the example of Epicurus. Epicurus, if you haven't been familiar with him,
yeah, I think
he was an
in English, I think in English it sounds like Epicurus, Epicurean
Epicurus.
philosophy.
Yes, Epicurus. Yes, Epicurus. It's in English. Well, he was an ancient Greek materialist philosopher, um, who believed that well, Epicurus said that, well, there are gods, they exist, but they have nothing to do with us. So we have nothing to do with them as well. Uh, and he taught also that the soul and the spirit are just material things composited by atoms, by material atoms, and so they are dying with the body. When the body dies, the soul dies as well. So what is the goal of life, according to Epicurus? The goal of life would have been happiness. But happiness, how we can achieve this happiness? He said, uh, happiness is not something that has to be um, achieved within what the common person, the common people finds as happy. He said that happiness is actually a state. It's a state of the soul. The soul may be material. It's not immaterial. It is material, but it is still a state of the soul, and it is a state of inner peace. Ataraxia, he called it. It is a state of inner peace. So only the person, the philosopher, is this person is really happy. The person who has achieved this station of inner peace, according to a materialist philosopher. Uh, and this, of course, it's true. Because if our reality, if our world is just a material world, then we do not, well, happiness is a state of peace. When you have free, when Fred set yourself free of passions and of animalistic tendencies, if you can call it this way. So yes, even materialism has some points of truth, but of course they take the whole picture wrong. That doesn't mean they're wrong entirely.
This reminds me of a lot of something that Nisargadatta has said. Who Nisargadatta, for those who are not familiar, he was kind of a little bit more recent version of Ramana Maharshi, and a little bit more obnoxious, I guess, more, which is fitting for our times. But I think he just passed away in the 1980s, actually. He's the last that I know of the probably real Jnanis in India. But he used to often say pure objectivity and pure subjectivity are the same. So if if we if we look at, we could say that Epicurus was a sort of form of pure objectivity, like in the sacred sense, because like Nisargadatta used to say, you would say I either own all of it or own none of it, right? So by
Yes.
owning all of it, that means that everything that happens is your responsibility. Everything, whether you think somebody else did it, it was your fault, right? Like, and I think the Buddhists also have something
Hmm.
reminiscent of this. Like when somebody,
Yes.
the Buddhists, I think Zen says something about this. He said like the world's sins are your sins. Or on the other side, like Epicurus, he would say, if everything is just going on and none of it is you, right? Like it's hard to say
Exactly.
which, but we can see the analogy between the two, right? Either it's all yours or it's none of yours. And where the deviation I feel like really comes in is when people own some of it but not all of it. Like they're like, well, this is my responsibility, but that's not, right? So um um it's an interesting phenomenon and it reminds me of Christ's statement, in Revelation that if you're lukewarm, I'll spew you out of my mouth. I either take all of it or none of it. You can't cherry pick what
Yes.
you want. So I think the sort of profane materialists are still cherry picking, right? Of course, they have a little bit of truth. They have an inversion of the truth there, but they still are claiming some of the responsibility, but not all the responsibility, right? Whereas I think an
Yes.
Epicurean, and this speaks to I think his longevity also, and we can go from this, we can go into it's talking about paganism as well. But I think this speaks to his longevity. To this day, I constantly on social media, I constantly see quotes from Epicurus. Constantly, I see like little meme quotes from him all the time, right? So if he was completely bogus, why this longevity? You know? So he must have, as you're saying, he must have been onto something because longevity is another mark of truth, right? You say like or orthodoxy, right? For me,
Yes,
it's
indeed.
one of the trademark stuff, but it's not the only one. It's not a litmus test, but it's an indication. If something is continuing for thousands of years, and I don't mean errors that reappear every continually. Like I feel like evolutionism is one of these errors that it just keeps popping back up again. But something like Epicurean, it's continued steadily. His work has been
Yes.
preserved by people who thought it was valuable. You know.
Hmm.
So let's from that let's speak about this is one of the two topics I really wanted to get into or really wanted to examine was uh, Greco-Roman paganism, right? Growing up as Roman Catholic, we're taught that the pagans were just they were at best they were just like groping around in the dark, and at worst they were worshiping the devil. And I think Saint Paul in one of the epistles actually says something to that effect. He said all the pagan gods are demons,
Yes.
right? Um, so so why don't we say so starting at first in Greek Orthodoxy, why don't you tell us how growing up as Greek Orthodox, how paganism is viewed and how it's taught to you, and then let's talk about what we believe paganism actually was.
Yes. Well, I was grown up with the belief that was indoctrinated on me that Greek paganism, that is the ancient Greek religion, if we can call it this way, uh, was more or less a bunch of mythology, kind of myths, that is imaginative stories, stories with no uh, historical substance. And also that the gods of the pagans were non-real beings, and some people, some Christians, they even go there when you say that right now that they're saying that the ancient Greeks worshipped demons. That they worshipped demons in the image of the Olympian gods, for example. That Zeus was Satan, perhaps in another form, uh, and they often present as evidence of their view, of their opinion that Greek myths have the gods to engage into more or less human activities, especially the whole sexual thing between gods and mortals, or between gods themselves. They find they think it is an evidence that the gods were demons in the Christian meaning of the term demon, of course. There were demons, and the ancient people before Christ worshipped demons in the form of their gods. Uh, which of course, I do not accept this opinion anymore. It's needless to say that. Um, but again, as you also said correctly, Saint Paul teaches us that pagans worship the devil, but what he is referring to uh, is more certainly the degenerated cults of his era that he engaged, for example, at Ephesus when he preached uh, the gospel. He engaged some kind of this stuff, of worshiping lower forms of beings, and this whole thing, it relates definitely with uh, the degeneration of the pre-Christian traditions of Greece and of Rome, but also of other European peoples, uh, that has started during the historical times. And it is culminated during the appearance of Christ in the Greco-Roman world. Uh, in the Greco-Roman world, during the earthly ministry of Jesus, we have a uh, very syncretic uh, staff of deities and uh, and worshiping different gods, but not at in a way. Uh, well, I can take the example of the coexistence between Buddhism and Shinto in Japan. But it wasn't the same way. In Japan, we have a kind of a more or less natural symbiosis, coexistence between Shinto and Buddhism. While in the Greco-Roman world, we had uh, a very, um, I'm not finding the word right now to say it.
You should be between the paganism and Christianity.
Yes, no,
Uh, is it you? Do you mean like it had more of an antagonistic relationship?
yes, no, yes, no, not just that. I mean, within paganism itself,
Oh, certainly. Yeah,
within
you had
paganism itself,
sect, you had sect,
we have a kind,
sectarianism,
yeah,
sectarianism. Right?
yes, a kind of sectarianism and a kind of mingling between different forms without coherence, without
Yes, yes, yeah. I know. I see
that's
what
what
you're
I'm
saying.
trying to say.
Yeah. So it's
We have a strange combination between Greek deities and Near Eastern deities and Egyptian deities
right.
without
And this,
it's just
this goes on. From what I understand, this goes on even in India right now. And but for them, it's not an issue. You'll have they'll bring in images of Christ, images of the Buddha, images of other figure, Ramana Maharshi or something, and they'll just all take their place on the mantle, and nobody has any kind of mental issue with it. It just flows for them, and it reminds me I had there was an Indian kind of Indian convenience store where I grew up in New York, and they used to have over the counter uh he had I wish I wish I could put up a picture of it. I actually have a picture of it still. They put up a picture over the counter of the Buddha, Christ, excuse me, of the Buddha, Christ, Krishna, and some other figures. And then he of over it, or he had the from the Rig Veda. He had the statement from the Rig Veda in big letters. That which exists is one. We call it by many names. So for them, it was never an issue. But I see what you're saying. So for to the extent that in Greek paganism you had orthodoxy, right? The There was this sort of problem there, right? For them, and this
yes, there was a sort of problem because the people no longer understood their tradition. They no longer got it right. Uh, Now, of course, we have some exceptions in the kind of people like Plotinus or Proclus, that were Platonist philosophers. But this is an exception. The vast majority of people and the society, they no longer understood the gods. They no longer understood the nature of God and of the gods. And that was a problem, of course. And the coming of Christ in the middle of such a world, such a situation is definitely providential.
Yeah, and speaking of Shinto, I'm glad you brought up Shinto. So uh, people,
And
people,
excuse me, before we talk about Shinto, we can find traces or evidence in what I said about Greco-Roman paganism, uh, in the fact that the anti-pagan laws that they were inflicted against paganism by the Christian emperors after the time of Constantine. Um they wiped out the whole pagan out of the picture. And just within 2 or 3 centuries, there was no more paganism. Just 200 years after the death of Constantine, we almost had no pagans left in the empire. We have no pagans left. But uh, 3 centuries of persecutions of pagan Roman emperors against Christianity and against Christians, they did they didn't even touch it.
yeah, of course, a Christian from a normative Christian perspective, they would argue that that's evidence that paganism is false and Christianity is true, right? That the paganism was the darkness that just was
Yeah.
taken out by the light of
Yeah, I
Christianity,
know.
right?
Yeah.
Which there is truth to that, right? I mean, we can't argue, especially as Christians, we can't argue that. But there's as you described, there was more going on. It wasn't simply a matter of paganism false and Christianity true. There was and this touches on one of the points that I really wanted to make was that when Gunan made the distinction between the religious view and the metaphysical view, the religious view is based on historical contingencies. So we could say like the religious view is like in motion, right? Whereas the metaphysical view has never changed and will never change. The metaphysical view, of course, is based on principles. So it just so happens that the religious the conditions of the manifestation changed such that the paganism was no longer, we could say, effective. It was no longer doing what it was supposed to be doing. And then
See,
that's why we had the Christian revelation appear to address. And then, this is these arguments, once you see these patterns, then we understand also why Islam appeared. Because contrary to popular belief, before the appearance of Islam, the Middle East was not all Christian or just Jew, etc., what have you. They also had their own problems with their own paganism. And I think
yes, sure.
they descended it into the sort of deviant forms of paganism, probably even from what I understand, probably even worse than Greece and Rome did, because you had these infamous sex cults on the Arabian Peninsula that the Prophet Muhammad ordered to be destroyed, and then they were in this in Mecca and what have you. But one I just wanted to make a point that so I have a little bit of a background in Shinto, because people may, you may be aware. So my wife is from Japan, and I also lived in Japan for a period, and I used to visit Shinto temples and Buddhist temples there and everything. And at the time, I didn't really understand what I was looking at, but you definitely feel something there. It's not demonic as we would be told. But one of the things I found interesting about Shinto, so for those who are not familiar, Shinto is like it's the native paganism of Japan. It's their version of Greco-Roman paganism, and it's still there to this day. It's still going on, of course. Similar to, like you said, they don't even really understand they don't even understand it anymore themselves. But it's still there in the temples, and if I'm not mistaken, I think it's actually still funded by the government even. But I was asking myself, I said, how did Shinto survive while Greco-Roman paganism fell? Right, because there's quite some similarities there. And from a Christian perspective, Shinto is maybe even more um, demonic. I use it, of course, sarcastically, because they believe that you can even invent gods, and that the invented gods are also real. I don't know. Did Greek paganism have this same concept where the gods, or did they just believe the gods were sort of objectively, they had their own existence?
Uh, I think no. I think the answer is no. At least in principle, they accepted that the gods were fixed. They
Okay.
were fixed beings that
Yeah.
existed in within the universe.
Okay.
Because the Olympian gods and the gods, the personal deities of the Greek religion, uh, must not be identified with what in Christianity or in Islam we call God. It is a different.
Yeah.
There's a very
Yeah. And
important differences.
yeah, in Shinto, they call them kami. And kami means like a lowercase g god, same idea. But so I was
Hmm.
asking myself, is that why did Shinto survive to this day? I guess as it, of course, it's not in the same form it was hundreds of thousands of years ago, but it's still there. So why did it survive to this day, whereas Greco-Roman paganism completely disintegrated? And I can only think of the notion of the individual and of individualism. Now, of course, when you have what we understand to be polytheism, a pantheon of gods all interacting with each other, from the point of view of a modern Westerner, it looks absurd, right? Because we're looking at it from the sensibilities of an individualist. Even if we don't consider us, even if we're a communist, we still consider we're looking at it through these eyes of the individual.
Hmm.
Whereas in Japan, of course, things changed the way they have everywhere now, but this concept of the individual does not exist in the Far East as we understand it in the West. So if you're looking if a Japanese person is looking at Shinto, the Shinto gods from the point of view of I to say a more collectivist point of view, it's not an issue for them because they don't even they believe the gods are all just part of a whole, the same as they view themselves as part of a whole. There is no individual friction, and even if the individual friction appears, the friction itself is part of the whole. So this
Yes.
is so I'm wondering recently if the move from polytheism to monotheism was part of a going back to the three gunas again. As we go from the sort of tripartite division. Probably at the beginning of creation, I imagine there was non-duality, right? And this is often spoken of, I think, in some of the esoteric traditions with Adam. Adam was not separate from God, and I think in the beginning he didn't even there was no conversation. Like Adam in his very being, he was fulfilling God's will just in his existence. They weren't
Yes.
sitting and having to, they
His
weren't.
being, his being and his will were in accordance with God's will, and uh, that's why he didn't have to get clothes for himself. For example, he didn't have um, to kill animals. He his will was in accordance with God's will, and so his as well his being was in accordance with God's being. And that is the whole meaning of fall and the restoration of our original nature.
And as we so in the beginning, if we look at it in these non-dual terms that like you described, right? And then as we come down, we come into more dualistic terms of the first monotheism, we would say, where it was man and God, right? And then
Mhm.
and then it comes down even more into more personal terms, the personal monotheism, because there is a such thing as impersonal monotheism, right? Like the Hindus and the Buddhists have this version of monotheism. And then I believe as it come down to the middle, I might say the middle of the spiritual maturity, we wound up with this polytheism, which in the beginning I feel like was still sacred because of the absence of this notion of the individual. If you have no concept of the individual, and I know in ancient Greece everything was very collective in the beginning, right? The what would you call the metropolis or the city state? It like moved as a whole, and
Yes, the
even in
city-state
their wars,
metropolis.
all of the men were expected to fight because of this collective mentality, and there was no issue with this. The men it didn't matter like Socrates himself. A philosopher was expected to fight and
Yes, of
his
course.
courage was
And
viewed as part of his
and
virtue.
the citizen of the city state was expected to follow the traditional worship of the city. That is a very important notion that we don't find it in later paganism.
Oh, okay.
The citizen was expected to um, to worship the god of the protective god of the city, and to take part into the rituals of the metropolis. That was a very important thing. If you didn't took part in the traditional rites uh, and into accepting the god, the city's god, then have to you really had a good chance to be accused of atheism
Yeah,
if
and
you
what
didn't
wasn't
accept
wasn't
that.
weren't you that's like the word ostracized? Maybe you could even be sent out, kicked out, sent out.
Yes, yes, it could. Yes, someone could have been kicked out,
And
could have
which for
kicked out
back then that
from the
was the
city
equivalent.
because some people may view him as sacrilegious, as because he didn't participate in the traditional rite, in the traditional worship of the city.
Yeah, which back then was viewed as a severe liability to the whole.
Exactly.
If one man was creating a problem like this, he would bring hardship. You know, back then hardship isn't like we think of it now, and back then they had real hardship. You know, invasions or famine or and so back then
Yes, sure.
this one man's because of his blasphemy or his atheism, he could bring a curse on the collective, and so it was viewed with very severely, right? And it's you mentioned speaking of
Hmm.
the analogy with the parallels with Shinto again. They still have I'm not sure if to this day they still have they call Matsuri. Matsuri is a festival. They still have the Matsuri to the particular gods. They may. I'm not feeling, but they do have the sort of city Matsuri, the city festivals dedicated. Actually, no, I take that back. They do have it to the particular gods because I lived in Osaka in Japan for 1 year, and I had the opportunity. In retrospect, it was really a remarkable opportunity to participate and run in it's called the Tanjin, I believe Tanjin, I forget, it's been 20 years, but I think Tanjin Matsuri, which is where they take the god out of the shrine. It's the Osaka's patron, the god, the kami. They take it out of the shrine and they parade it through the street,
Hmm.
and then the men just go crazy. I mean, everyone wears the same outfit, and they're all running. They run through the streets for about 2 days, I think, straight, and then it's really kind of rambunctious and what have you. And I had the opportunity to participate. One of my Japanese friends, this is back when there were very few foreigners in Japan. He invited me in and let me run. I actually got to run with them. And so it's
Hmm.
very similar to what you're describing, where the city or the area had their own god, and everyone was same in Japan, same thing. If you were a Japanese person and you did not participate, now is different. Now nobody cares. But historically, if you were a member of a Japanese town and you did not participate, I mean, you would be viewed as a criminal almost, or insane. You would be viewed as insane.
A blaspheme, perhaps.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. You were viewed as that you had mentally there's something wrong with you because everybody,
Hmm.
whether even if you didn't believe in it, you still participate, right? You just put on the appearance.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, well, I feel like we could spend so much time on this topic of paganism. I just wanted to add, so the I mentioned so I recently I had the opportunity to attend. There was a religious exhibit at the art museum here, and they had some old artifacts, some pagan artifacts, artifacts from all over the world. In particular, they had a nice collection of Greco-Roman pagan artifacts.
Hmm.
And I mean, I'm interested in just religion generally, but when I looked at these artifacts, I was surprised to I was surprised that I felt power coming out of the sculptures. And it was they had them at so they weren't even behind glass. So I can actually go up quite close to these sculptures and really kind of observe them and just be next to them. And I definitely felt an energy to them. And then when I mentioned this to Charles Upton, he said, well, that's not surprising because when those sculptures were placed in the temples, the priests would do I guess we call it the equivalent of like a blessing. They would invoke the deity into the statue or into the sculpture. So what I was looking at was
Yes.
not just a piece of stone. Somebody at some
Hmm.
point, somebody's intention, subjective, and at the time they were very influential men, right? The pagan priests at the time, somebody's very powerful subjective intention was put into that artifact.
Yes, of course, and the same can be said with regard to Christian icons. Some Christian icons of very they are very important. Um, they have a similar theology behind them. They
Yeah,
have
when they
they have a similar theology.
yeah when they're because when they're placed in the church, in a according to the proper tradition, they would have to be blessed, right, by the priest.
Mhm. Exactly. Yeah, they have to be blessed, and still today, there are some particular icons that are considered to be very powerful from a spiritual point of view.
And I just wanted to add, I want to get a little bit into the other topic before we run out of time here, but I just wanted to add that, of course, we have St. Paul in the epistles kind of denigrating paganism, but we also have some examples in Christian tradition of the Christian records of the early Christians interacting very on very friendly terms with the early pagans. And I was surprised when I was reading the book, The Sayings of the Desert Fathers. I don't know if you ever read this one, but the Desert
Hmm.
Fathers in Egypt and in the Middle East.
Yes.
And there are there are there are some examples in there of the early Desert Fathers interacting or actually taking advice from the pagans. And I saw one example where they were some of the Desert Fathers were interacting with the pagans of that region, and the pagans told they were kind of instructing them how to pray. They said you have to you're not your heart is not pure. That's why your prayers are not being answered. This was a pagan speaking to the Christians. Now,
Yes.
and not only just any Christians, but these were the early Christians, which from our perspective now, the early Christians were like giants. These were
Hmm.
extremely holy men. And so for the pagans to be giving not only advice but actually good advice to the early Christians is pretty remarkable.
Yes, certainly. We have this also in Islam. In early Sufism, there was a Sufi, a very known Sufi saint that his first spiritual master was an Eastern Orthodox monk. His first spiritual guide was an Eastern Orthodox monk, um, uh, and they had a very close relationship. The one was a Christian, the other was a Muslim, but not neither of them sought to abandon their tradition for the other. So yes, there are examples of such a kind of spiritual friendship between people of different uh, religious traditions. If I'm right, I think even the uh, Origen, the great theologian and church father of the early centuries, um, had a personal uh, um, kind of a personal relationship with the great pagan philosopher Plotinus. They knew each other because they were pupils to the same teacher once, and they knew each other, and Plotinus held Origen on a high esteem. The, he thought of him as he was a very important person, even though he wasn't a pagan, he was a Christian.
Yeah, that reminds me of a saying that I saw about or a quote I saw about Saint John Chrysostom, where of course we know that Saint John Chrysostom was raised. Well, correct me if I'm wrong. Was he was raised in a pagan family? I believe he was raised in a pagan family, and there were expectations for him.
Uh, Saint John Chrysostom.
Yes.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure about him. It's been a while since I read his
Yeah.
bios,
I'm
and I
I'm
don't remember.
if I may be mistaken about his upbringing. I believe that he was born and raised a pagan and wound up becoming Christian. I believe I could be wrong about that, but I do know that they're on record that when he became Christian later on, that the pagan priests at the time said they said he would have been one of our best, but the Christians got him instead. Which
Yes, there was a, I think it was the pagan rhetorician Libanius, I think, was he was an Antiochian, and he was a friend and uh, and a teacher to the very well-known pagan emperor Julian, and they knew each other. But he also knew of Saint John Chrysostom. He was his papal as well. John was the papal of Libanius, and Libanius was a pagan who also wrote against Christians. He was written some speaks of him uh, very strongly against Christianity, against the Christians.
Yeah, so we could see, as would be expected, that as Christianity grew in strength and in following, there this antagonism did appear, and it this and like we said, of course, paganism had degraded at that point. So certainly there was a reason why it was replaced by Christianity, but it also demonstrates something, a point that I often make, is that just because two men are in conflict with each other, it doesn't necessarily mean that one is good and one is evil. This is one of the, I feel like one of the
True.
main Western deviations is that they now conflate, and we see this in the more Western the Christianity, the more we see this exhibited, that they conflate theology with morality, right? And there is room within even the most sacred of doctrines for disagreement. And it doesn't necessarily mean that one side is immoral and one side is moral, right? But in Christianity, we see this, and like I said, as we get, the more Western we get, the more we see this in action. And conversely, the more Eastern you go, when I lived in Japan, I became familiar, I had more exposure to East Asia. I noticed that they don't, for them, there's a lot in terms of morality. There's no problem with other theological views. They don't even, if you were to introduce this idea to them, and they're actually kind of, I can only speak from my experience in Japan, they're actually kind of afraid of Christianity for this reason, because they feel like Christians view them as being immoral just for not being Christian, regardless of their behavior.
Mhm.
And when I would meet a new Japanese person, and they would find out that I'm a Christian, there was a little bit of a timidness there, and they said, oh, like they were afraid to offend me, and I said, no, I said, look, don't worry, I'm not, I'm interested in Shinto and Buddhism and all that.
Mhm. Mhm.
It's so
Yeah.
interesting, and this is something that I feel like Genon and Shuan used to examine this, but in Christianity, it's not examined. They assume that everybody has the same mentality. From east to west, everybody is working with the same raw mentality, and you're either wrong or you're right.
Mhm. Yes, you're right on that. Uh, there is a tendency to build a connection between the moral values of a person and the truth of his doctrines uh, from the Christian point of view, of course, by the viewpoint of the Christians, um, which as we know, it's not always correct. There were some pagan people who were very virtuous, and there were some Christian guys who were really immoral Christians.
Yeah.
They were not so moral.
Yeah, we see it continuing to this day. I may have mentioned the anecdote before, but when I went away from church for many years, and then when I came back, I finally came back, and I went to the church that I wound up returning to was not the Roman Catholic Church of my upbringing, but I wound up going to an Eastern Catholic church, and that's where I found my home, my sort of rebirth as a Christian, and I became very close with the priest who is Lebanese, and the congregation is mostly Middle Eastern. And when
Hmm.
I after a few months of me attending this church, and I was like so because coming from I was never an atheist, but I was coming from I didn't go to church, so I was coming from the world, so to speak, the profane world, coming into the church environment. And then one day I was speaking with the priest, and he was stressed out, and he was telling me that the congregation, the members were fighting with each other. They were arguing with each other over, I forget what the topic was, but he said it was he was having a lot of stress because he was trying to act as the mediator
Hmm.
between the different people fighting in the church. And when I heard this, it was surprising to me because I was like, wait, they're fighting, they're arguing, but I thought we're in church, like everybody loves each other, right? Like we're and he looks at me like all surprised, and he goes, "They are human. What do you expect?" But it just goes to show, and I don't mean that to say that they were immoral in any means, but it just goes to show that
Hmm.
you don't suddenly things don't suddenly become utopian when you enter into the church or when you enter into Christianity. And there's this view of that as well, that like, no, once you become Christian, you things change, and they do. But the same
Exactly.
problem, and
Yes.
sometimes it can exacerbate the problems.
Exactly. Yes. It's a very important problem that you touched right now.
Yeah, and we see this. It's funny because when it goes on within a denomination, it's often so for the people who argue that any given denomination is false, or only their denomination, their Christian denomination is true. They often
Hmm.
like they cite the disagreement as evidence, like ipso facto, like in and of itself, that's the evidence that one side is true, that one side is moral and the other side is immoral, or one side is. But it goes on even within the orthodoxy itself, with Orthodox Christianity, you have a lot of disputes. Just the fact
Yes,
that people are fighting is
certain.
not evidence that somebody is wrong. They could be correct, but they're just having a difference in opinion. It's going back to your
Yes,
about
exactly.
Plato, difference of opinion.
Hmm. Well, you wanted to also to touch the subject of how is to be a Christian with perennialist views
Right. Yeah.
in practice and in
Yeah. I
theory.
wanted to. The paganism topic is it's so fascinating, and it's so I feel like it's not examined enough. It's either if it is examined, it's by people like neo-pagans who also are just kind of a continuation of the profane paganism of the past. So maybe one day we can
Hmm.
make another video on just the pagan issue because man, it is interesting.
Just is a very, very
Yeah.
interesting
Yeah. Uh,
subject.
yeah, and but so we have a few more minutes. So this was supposed to be the theme of the video, right? But that's okay. I
Yeah.
mean, what we're going to talk about now. But so as a Christian with perennialist views, and I don't know, it would take too long for us to go into the history of how we wound up with these views. But so how do we reconcile this contradiction in our minds? So let's start out with what is it? Or praxis and orthos? Is that what it is? The practice and theory, or is it praxis and theory? But anyway, in English we say practice
Yes,
and theory, right?
it is practice and theory,
Yeah.
but uh, it's common to start with theory. So in theory, well, which is for me, it's the most important thing because it happens within you. Uh, Practice is uh, it's just a prolongation of theory. Well, for me to be a Christian perennialist or a Christian with perennialist views in theory, that is, in my own mind, it was really difficult in the beginning. At the beginning, it was difficult to compromise more or less the two viewpoints and how Jesus Christ is the one and only manifestation or incarnation of God in history, which is the typical Christian view. And on the other hand, that more than one religions are true in their convictions. That was a real different, real difficult, sorry, a really difficult thing for me to to find the middle way between uh, those two views. Uh, and in the end, it was an understanding of uh, the basic Christian dogma uh, of discrimination between God's essence, what we call the essence of God, the inner nature of God, and the energy of God, or the grace of God, which is the outer nature of God. That is the outer nature of God. Uh, in in Orthodox Christianity, we have this doctrine that the essence is one, the essence of God is one, but his energy his energy is also one, but it also contains in itself multiplicity. So we have one energy, but we also have more energies. We have many energies of God. Uh, and from this Christian doctrine, uh, I think that you can take an understanding of other religions, because if God is one, but His grace is multiplied or multiplied, then why not the other religions have not their partake in grace, in God's grace? So how can you accept as a Christian that God's energy is all around you, but for example, Buddhism or Hinduism or Islam, they are forms that they're devoid of God's grace or of God's energy? That was a very important notion for me to understand how can you be how one can be Christian while at the same time accept that all the religions are also true. Uh, that is the basic idea of the Perennialist school. Well, so yes, in theory that was the main problem for me, and that is why I solved it, or I believe that I solved it this way for me at
Yeah.
least.
That's really interesting that you solved it from a I could almost say from a purely Christian perspective. That's really fascinating. I think maybe you benefited from the Orthodox Christian background there because you know of course you guys have a bit more of a mystical theology, the benefit of more of a more of a I gotta say it's a more fluid theology, I feel like. Whereas in Roman Catholicism, our theology is very fixed and very hard, you know.
Mm,
But you can see it from I came to it even as a Christian. I came to it from when I was exposed, of course, living in Asia, kind of began to adjust my thinking. And then when I began to read about to study the Vedanta, I came across which the analogy is often used as the sun and its rays, you know, the sun and its light.
hmm.
So it's identical to the essence and energies distinction. You know, the sun and its
Yes, it is
rays are the
identical.
same.
Yeah.
If the
We
sun,
use
if
the same analogy.
yeah,
We use the same analogy of the sun and his and the light of sun that is
yeah,
radiated.
and if you're in the ray of the sun, then you are in the sun. You know, you're not you're in it, but you're not in it, right? So
Yes.
the the essence of energy's distinction would say, it's commonly cited, and there's a view that I call perennialism light. It sounds like I'm kind of denigrating it, but I actually do respect it because it's like I always say, it's good for who it's good for. And for those who believe that in the Christian tradition, for those who believe that other traditions have some truth, but they don't have the full truth, for me, they're not using their symbolism to the fullest extent, because if you're the sun's ray is the sun's ray. There's not this ray is more of the sun than that ray. It's all the sun. So
Yes,
like they say, you take all of it or none of it. And by that I don't mean you take every single deviant view that exists, because that's just getting into pure falsity. But if it's I'm often asked, well, by more normatively minded Christians, they say, well, how do you know what's true then? How do you judge what's true? If for you Christianity is not the only truth, then how do you judge what's true? And I say, but it's the only way to answer that. If it's true, it's true if it's true. How do you judge anything to be true? You just say it's true. You can't work it out empirically. Only the most petty, only the pettiest and least important truths can be worked out empirically. The highest truths have to be worked out intuitively, of course we use a support. We can use a rational support, like you use the essence energy distinction as a support. But ultimately,
hmm
it's the intuition is kind of pulling you up through that. It's just using it as a helper. You can't
exactly.
you can't get on a pen and paper and be like, all right, let me work this out, in words and numbers. It's not going to work. So it's if it is it true? Well, yeah, it's true if it's true, and if it's not true, it's not true. So it's like Rumi's famous writing, right? Fihi ma fihi. It is what it is, right? So he was
Yes.
popular saying. He was already saying it how many centuries ago? So um, yeah, so when you come to this realization, and I often get scolded by more normatively minded Christians, like you have to you're wrong. You have to fix your error. And I just think back to them like, how can I? It's like you're telling me this. Don't stop seeing the sun. Don't see the sun anymore. I can't stop seeing. Once you see it,
Yes.
see it. I can't stop seeing it. What am I going to do? You want me to make believe? Okay, John 3:16. That's all there is to it. There's nothing else. Okay, we'll play make believe. That's fine. But
Mhm.
once you see it, you see it.
Yes, it is. I think it is a very difficult subject for most Christian theologians to deal with. The subject of the validity of other faiths, of other traditions, because we tend to see our own religion as the only true in every single possible way, which is wasn't held to even by some great Christian theologians. The As we said before, for paganism, there were some early Christian theologians, apologists, and others who accepted that yes, there was some part of truth within paganism. Of course, they couldn't say that uh, the, it is an equal saving path as Christianity is, but they accepted yet that the pagans had their partake in truth. It's not just a devil-like counterfeit.
Yeah, we can see how we bump up against like the sola scriptura sort of Protestant view, because if St. Paul said, if Paul said they're worshiping demons, well, that's it. Case
hmm
closed. There's nothing else to say, talk about it. But what can we say? I mean, St. Paul he disputed with St. Peter. He wasn't Christ. Even they, as inspired and as holy as they were, even they were still interpreting. Even they were inspired, but they were also interpreting.
hmm
Both. They weren't. If we
Yeah.
accept St. Paul's words as on the same level as Christ, then we do a disservice. We're conversely we're denigrating Christ, right? Because Christ's words are gospel, literally gospel truth, right? And then the epistles, they were still trying to They were inspired by the Holy Spirit, but they were also interpreting, and that's how they wind up in disputes with each other. See, in the epistles, a lot of them they're arguing with each other.
Hmm. Exactly.
So the last thing we
Uh,
touch on is
so in practice, well, in the practical uh, the practical side, it's also somewhat difficult because uh, there aren't many Christians that they are affiliated with the perennialist point of view. Many of them are not able to understand it correctly. They're not able to understand the Genonian perspective, for example. It is very difficult for them. Uh, and so I find myself that I tend not to share my views with many of my co-religionists. There are of course some people that I trust and we do conversations about these subjects, but it is not something uh, that I would say to a church sermon, for example. It's not something that I will go out to a sermon in my church and say that uh, other traditions or other religions are also true and we have to accept them. That's not the way it works.
yeah. No, I've
Definitely not
depending
the way
on
it works.
yeah, depending on how I feel. I mean, I've learned that lesson to not. I've gotten pretty good at feeling people out, although. Yeah, I made that mistake when I mentioned when I first went back to church first time, and I mentioned that to my old priest, and he was just like looked at me. He's a little more open minded. He's from Lebanon and he's very Orthodox, but and he's relatively open, but he was relatively open minded in it because he growing up in Lebanon, you kind of he had to be to in order to maintain a sort of camaraderie with his countrymen, you know. But I mentioned it to him, and he, as kind as he was, he just kind of looked at me. And he was just like, I mentioned about other traditions being valid. He looked at me. He was just like, no. He was just like, no, that's not how it is.
Yes, that's why it is a very sensitive subject
Yeah. Although he did,
to discuss.
he was. I mentioned that there was a lot of for example, Islam has a lot of wisdom, and he agreed. He was like, oh, absolutely. He's like they have a lot of wisdom, no question. So there are levels,
Yes, but he would never accept, for example, that Islam could be another revelation of God.
right? Because according to the logic of both normative Christianity and normative Islam, then he would have to become Muslim, right? If he accepted that.
Yeah.
Whereas from the perspective of Sufism, as far as I'm aware, they're fine with Christians, although they would recommend that because we don't have access to a proper esoteric order, they would say, well, you should become Muslim for that reason, right? Because you can't be a
Hmm.
Sufi and a Christian at the same time. Um, but I think the point, so we can close on that, I wanted to stress, and like you touched on, is that in practice, I mean, our worship life, our religious life doesn't, in practice, it doesn't look any different from an ordinary Christian. I don't on my home
No,
earth,
it is the exoteric side is the same. It's absolutely the same. The outer form is absolutely the same, and it has to remain this way.
yeah, we could think of it
Doesn't
like
mean that doesn't mean that if you are a Christian that share some perennialist views, that doesn't mean that you have uh, to go and pray also in a mosque or in a Buddhist temple. That's totally out of the question.
yeah, which would be what on this that would be the question of syncretism, which I've tried so hard on this channel to stress syncretism. We are not syncretists. Yeah, that the syncretism is again
Yes.
held it to be a very severe error. Schuon, at least in his books, stated that it was an error. In his personal practice, who knows what he was actually doing? But
Well, that's something that I wanted to came across. Uh, in our conversation that because someone identifies himself as a perennialist or as a traditional, that doesn't mean that I hold that everything that Suan said, for example, or that everything that Genon wrote and said, they are absolutely true. As you said, Swan said in his books that syncretism is always an error, as you rightly say. But there is also uh, an interview of him. Uh, there, I think there's the video in YouTube is available in YouTube when he says that for a pure soterist, for a person that is for a person that his perspective is purely esoteric, uh, well, yes, there is a kind of syncretism that is it is
Possible, yeah.
yes, it is possible for him to do. And I think that's why he also participated himself in some kind of native Indian stuff, while at the same time being
Muslim, yeah.
a Sufi master. Now, of course, some people like Sayyid Hussein Nasser uh, has wrote and said that Swan was he was an Orthodox Muslim and an orthopraxic Muslim, of course, that his practice was right, as well as his doctrine, uh, which I think it's true. He wasn't a heretic. He wasn't a kind of a heretic Muslim, but at the same time, he thought of himself that he was primarily a metaphysician and a soterist. He wasn't a kind. He wasn't the regular Muslim guy, even the regular Sufi guy. The,
Yeah,
that is a very important point.
I think I saw another clip of the video that you're referencing, I believe, and where he spoke, and this angers sort of more normative Muslims, and even the more open-minded Muslims when he says openly, he goes the exoteric Islam. He says I have no interest in it. You know, he just kind of just
Yes,
scoffs at
exactly.
it. He goes, I have no interest in them. He goes, the prayers. He's like, this I can do. I have no interest in it. You know, that's not what
Yeah.
interests me. So this is from I imagine from your perspective and from also from mine. I mean, this is not something that you say. Even if you thought it, you this is not something you say out loud, right? Because you're
Yes.
doing it. It's just, you're doing a great injustice, and you're making an offense against the your fellow Muslims, or for us, it would be our fellow Christians. Which I don't feel that way. But even if I did feel about the exoteric Christian practice, even if I did feel that way, I would never say it openly, and I probably would never even say it privately. So the fact that
Yes.
Shuan even felt I'm gonna say the sort of the boldness of to make that statement, it shows us, okay, well, you know, he went pretty far out there, you know, and we don't have to follow him there, but
Yes, sure. That's exactly.
yeah.
Well, and I don't know. Fridtjof Swan was a very important person and a very interesting one, quite interesting person. Uh, that well, I don't know if he has surpassed form as such. So he didn't have a use for it at the end of the day. Uh, but again, well, of course, he certainly is not to be equated with the other side of the tide. You know, the whole New Age type of guys. He definitely wasn't such thing.
Oh, with you mean like a kind of I guess kind of like a Deepak Chopra or something, the New Age, Eckhart Tolle and these types of guys. I know
Yes,
he's
yes, because
completely
that's
no, he would
you know
never. I
because
mean, he would be completely rejected in those circles. I mean, if he,
yes,
he
because when I was doing my master research, my research for my master thesis, my supervisor professor uh, couldn't understand the difference between the traditional school and the so-called new religions. He wasn't able to understand the difference because he thought he saw the whole thing from a scientific viewpoint,
Yeah,
and
it's. I mean,
so
it's understandable. You know, I get this a lot. They say, well, if you accept, then, and this is another topic that I find absolutely fascinating, which is, well, if you accept other traditions as true, then what about the sort of the deviant traditions like Mormonism or Jehovah's Witness or what have these sort of fringe, although very popular and very
yeah,
influential, these sort of fringe traditions. And I think Schuon's statement on it was that it comes down to your sincerity, right? Even if you're in a deviant tradition, I mean, of course, there's a limit. You know, you can't be in like a sex cult or something, right? But if even if you're in a deviant tradition, like a deviant bhakti tradition, I get, or I don't know what Mormons actually do, but there's still a possibility. It's not as solid a path as the Orthodox paths, but there is a glimmer of possibility within there do that your sincerity can take you to the end.
yes, because no one clearly understands the will of God and who is going to be saved, of course. And he adds too that this guy he may be saved. You know that the divine guy, the divine that, uh, for example, a Jehovah Witness or a Baha'ist. He said yes, some guy like that could be saved, but he definitely wouldn't be saved because of the truth of his doctrine. There may be other reasons, but not not the truth of his doctrine.
Yeah, this is getting back into the objective and the subjective distinction. Whereas, you know, even if their doctrine is objectively false,
Mhm.
they can be saved by their subjectivity. You know, and of course, there's a limit. You know, it's like I said, people will say, well, though, so you know, a member of the most evil cult can still be saved. Of course, there's a limit always, but this is the paradox of that. And in Western religion now, you know, we've lost this understanding of the power of the subjectivity. You know, um,
Mhm. Yes.
yeah, we can. It's such a big topic. I feel we're coming up against our time, unfortunately. But yeah. So let's just leave it at that then. So this is the mystery and the beauty of it of this type of view is that in theory you're sort of you've gone out everywhere. You know, it's like Ibn Arabi said, like, you know, my heart has become a pasture for all forms. You know, my heart has become open to all
Mhm.
forms. So in theory, internally, you've gone out everywhere. Like internally, you've dissipated out. But
Yes.
externally, you're as rigid as the most rigid exclusivist, you know. And I
Mhm.
have this in I even have this in my own personal life when I associate with people, very exclusivist minded people, and they have I of course I'm not going to voice my views to them, but they look at me just in appearance and they look at my worship life and they say, well, he's just like me, you know, and they'll openly say just badmouth Islam to me and everything, and I just you know I just nod and say okay, you know, I don't agree. I just kind of let it roll off me because I'm not going to argue with them, but point being, there's nothing in my external practice that I'm doing that would cause them to raise an eyebrow, right? And I'm sure in your
Yes, exactly. And that's the whole point. That's why our life and our spiritual life, even more as Christians, should be and must be centered on the person of Christ. Even if we are perennialists, but we have to be Christians above all,
Yeah,
because only through the religious form you can surpass the form.
exactly. Yeah, the like Shuon, what he said, the form that saves can also said something to the effect of the form that saves can also imprison, which is again kind of outrageous from a exclusivist point of view. How could you say the form can imprison?
Yes,
You know, even religion can be turned into idolatry. Even the most sacred things can still be turned into idols. You know,
yes, of course.
yeah. And it just comes down to point of view, right? Um, well, okay. Well, Nikos, thank you very much. I feel like we have to continue this now because we've gone into such deep, we've gone out into deep water.
Yes, it was it was a very interesting conversation, and I would be happy if we can give another one.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we have to. I thought maybe
God's will in the future.
I thought naively that
Yeah.
we could fit these topics into 1 hour, but it seems like even the pagan topic alone is just we can go on for the and hey,
Yes, it's
even
like it's like that each topic would take an hour. And
yeah,
if we have four, for example, four topics to cover, then we need
yeah,
4 hours
yeah,
of conversation
seriously.
to.
Yeah. Well, okay, Nikos, let me let you go, and so we'll post this
Well,
up.
thank you, Jason.
Yeah, and then we'll see what feedback we get. And hopefully some people out there who have
Yeah, what?
been holding these views and wondering, maybe they'll see this and you know it'll help them a bit. So okay, Nikos, take care and have a good night.
Thank you, Jason.
All
Have
right.
a good night.